Sometimes the hardest choice a parent faces is asking a stranger to save their children's lives. In the brutal winter of 1871, Lenora finds herself collapsed in the Colorado snow with her dying twin boys, facing exactly that choice. She begs mountain man Duncan to feed her starving sons, promising him her life in return. Duncan, haunted by his own losses, takes them into his cabin, expecting only to help them survive the winter. But as the snow deepens and weeks pass, something unexpected happens between the broken woman and the lonely man. A bond forms that neither saw coming. What happens when two people who've lost everything discover they might have found what they need most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the towering pines like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the promise of death. Duncan McCready stood at the single window of his cabin, watching the snow fall in thick, relentless sheets across the Colorado Rockies. February of 1871 had brought the worst winter he'd seen in his 15 years on this mountain, and that was saying something. The thermometer nailed to his porch post hadn't climbed above 0 in 3 weeks. He turned away from the window, his boots heavy on the rough-hewn floorboards. The cabin felt smaller these days, though nothing had changed since he'd built it with his own hands back in '56. 20 by 30 feet of solid log construction, chinked tight against the elements, with a stone fireplace that could burn half a tree and still leave you shivering. It had everything a man needed to survive alone: a bed, a table, shelves lined with preserves and dried meat, and hooks for his hunting rifle, and the knife that never left his side. The knife. Duncan's hand moved unconsciously to touch the worn leather sheath at his belt. The blade inside bore the initials MR carved into the handle: Marie Rose McCready. His wife, dead these past 8 years, along with their daughter Anna, taken by the fever that swept through the mining camps in '63. He'd carved those initials himself during the long nights after he'd buried them. When the pain was so fresh, it felt like breathing glass. Marie had been 26 when she died, same as he was now at 34. She'd had hair the color of autumn leaves and a laugh that could make the darkest day seem bright. Anna had been 4, with her mother's eyes and a smile that could melt snow. They'd planned to expand the cabin that spring, maybe add another room for the children they hoped would follow. Instead, Duncan had spent that spring digging graves in the frozen ground. That's when he'd come to the mountain. Sold everything he owned in Denver, bought supplies for a year, and disappeared into the wilderness like smoke. The mining camps held too many memories. Every woman's laugh reminded him of Marie. Every child's cry brought Anna rushing back. So he'd chosen silence and solitude, trading human companionship for the honest brutality of mountain life. The first winter had nearly killed him. He'd been soft then, despite his years in the cavalry during the war. City living had dulled his edges, made him forget the lessons learned in the campaigns against Confederate forces in Tennessee and Georgia. But the mountain had taught him quickly how to read weather in the wind's direction, how to track game through snow deeper than a man's waist, how to stretch supplies when the hunting turned poor. Most importantly, it had taught him how to live with the quiet. For 8 years, that quiet had been his companion. He rose with the sun, tended his trap lines, hunted when the weather allowed, and spent the long winter evenings carving small figures from pine wood, birds, mostly, and sometimes the faces of people he'd known. The carvings lined his shelves now, a silent congregation of memories. His daily routine varied little. Morning coffee brewed strong and black. Breakfast of whatever game he'd taken, venison, rabbit, the occasional elk when he was fortunate. Then out to check the traps he'd set in a careful pattern around his territory, following paths he'd worn into the mountainside through years of repetition. Afternoons were for maintenance, repairing equipment, processing meat, splitting firewood. Evening brought the luxury of a hot meal and the flicker of lamplight on his books, a small collection of volumes that had survived the journey from his old life. He wasn't a hermit in the truest sense. Twice a year, He made the 2-day journey down to the settlement of Granite Falls to trade furs for supplies, coffee, ammunition, the few luxuries he allowed himself. The townspeople knew him as a fair dealer, but a man of few words. They'd learned not to press him with questions about his life on the mountain. Duncan MacReady paid his debts, minded his own business, and disappeared back into the wilderness like he'd never been there at all. But this winter had tested even his hard-won skills. The snow had started early in October and hadn't let up since. Game was scarce, driven to lower elevations or dead from the cold. His traplines had yielded little, the animals too smart or too frozen to venture out. He'd been rationing his supplies since Christmas, making each meal smaller, each pot of coffee weaker. Still, he'd survive. He always did. That's what the mountain had taught him. Endurance above all else. Comfort was temporary, warmth was precious, and death waited for the careless or unprepared. But a man with skill, patience, and the will to keep breathing could outlast almost anything nature threw at him. The wind gusted hard against the cabin, rattling the shutters and sending a puff of smoke back down the chimney. Duncan added another log to the fire and watched the flames lick higher. Outside, the storm was building to something fierce. He could feel it in the drop in temperature, the way the wind changed direction and intensity. This would be a 3-day blow at least, the kind that buried everything under drifts taller than a man. He was settling into his evening routine, cleaning his rifle, checking his ammunition, planning tomorrow's work if the weather allowed, when he heard it. At first, he thought it was just the wind, playing tricks with sound the way mountain storms could. But there it came again, faint but unmistakable. A human voice, calling out in distress. Duncan froze, his hands stilling on the rifle barrel. In 15 years on this mountain, no one had ever approached his cabin uninvited. Few people even knew it existed, tucked as it was into a fold of the mountainside, invisible from the main trails. Anyone caught out in weather like this would be lucky to survive another hour. The call came again, weaker this time, nearly swallowed by the wind. A woman's voice. Duncan set down his rifle and moved to the window, pressing his face against the glass. The darkness outside was complete, broken only by the wild dance of snowflakes in the wind. But somewhere out there, someone was dying in the cold. He grabbed his heavy coat and hat, checked that his knife was secure, and unbarred the door. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his eyes and stealing his breath. The cold bit through his clothing in seconds, reminding him why he'd learned to respect winter in all its forms. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely carrying in the wind. "Where are you?" The response came from his left down the slope toward the creek. Weak, desperate, Duncan grabbed a lantern from beside the door and plunged into the storm, following the sound. The snow was knee-deep and getting deeper with each step. His boots punched through the crust, and within minutes his legs ached from the effort of walking. 50 yards from his cabin, the lantern light caught something dark against the white, a figure huddled in the snow, nearly buried by the drifts. As he got closer, Duncan could see it was a woman, her hair plastered to her head with ice, her lips blue with cold. But she wasn't alone. Pressed against her sides, barely visible beneath a thin blanket, were 2 small forms. "Please," the woman whispered as Duncan knelt beside her. Her voice was barely a breath, but her eyes, dark, desperate, filled with a mother's fierce love, locked onto his. "My boys, they're dying. Feed them, and I'll be yours forever." The words hit Duncan harder than the wind. He'd thought himself beyond such appeals, immune to human need after so many years alone. But looking down at this woman, this mother, clutching her children against certain death, something cracked inside the walls he'd built around his heart. Without another word, he scooped up the nearest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6, light as a feather in his arms. The woman struggled to lift the other child, but Duncan shook his head. "I'll come back," he told her, having to shout to be heard over the wind. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though he could see the effort it cost her to stand. Together, they fought their way back up the slope, the woman leaning heavily on Duncan's arm. The boy in his arms, so still that Duncan feared he might already be too late. The warmth of the cabin hit them like a blessing. Duncan laid the child on his bed and went back for the other boy, while the woman collapsed beside the fireplace. When he returned with the second child, she had managed to pull herself closer to the flames, her whole body shaking with cold and exhaustion. Duncan had faced death before, in war, on the mountain, in the fever camps where he'd lost everything that mattered. But he'd never felt the particular weight of responsibility that settled on his shoulders as he looked at this makeshift family huddled in his cabin. 3 lives hung in the balance, and for the first time in 8 years, Duncan Macready found himself responsible for more than just his own survival. The woman looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Thank you," she whispered, and in those 2 words, Duncan heard a lifetime of gratitude and desperate hope. Duncan moved with the efficiency of a man who'd learned to act first and think later when lives hung in the balance. The boys needed warmth, food, and dry clothes in that order. Everything else could wait. He pulled thick woolen blankets from his trunk, wrapping each child carefully before placing them closer to the fire. Their breathing was shallow but steady, and while their lips were still blue with cold, he could see the faintest flush beginning to return to their cheeks. They were alive. That was enough to start with. The woman, she hadn't given her name yet, tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Duncan caught her before she could fall, surprised by how light she was. Beneath the ice-crusted coat, she felt like little more than bone and determination. "Easy," he said, helping her to the chair beside his table. "You're safe now. All of you." She looked up at him with those dark eyes, and Duncan saw something there he recognized, the hollow look of someone who'd been running on nothing but will for too long. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough during his first winter on the mountain. "The boys," she whispered, her gaze moving to her children. "They'll be fine," Duncan assured her, though he wasn't certain of that himself. "When did they last eat?" Her face crumpled. 2 days, maybe 3. "I'd lost track." Duncan nodded and moved to his stores, pulling down a pot and filling it with water from the barrel beside his door. He'd learned early in his mountain years that a man could survive a lot of hardships, but children were different. They burned through their reserves faster, had less to fall back on when times got lean. As the water heated, he examined what food he had available. His supplies were lower than he'd like. Winter had been hard on everyone, apparently, but he had enough. Dried meat, some preserved vegetables, a precious store of oats he'd been saving. It would make a thin but nourishing stew. "What's your name?" he asked as he worked, keeping his voice gentle. "Lenora," she said. "Lenora McKinnon. These are my boys." Her voice caught. "James and David, they're 6. Twins then." Duncan glanced at the children, noting the similarities now that he was looking for them. Same dark hair as their mother, same delicate bone structure. In better times, they'd probably been bright, active boys. Now they looked like small ghosts wrapped in his blankets. "I'm Duncan Macready," he said. "This is my home." Lenora nodded, then reached into her coat with trembling fingers. She pulled out 2 small wooden horses, carved with obvious care and worn smooth by small hands. Duncan recognized the craftsmanship. Someone had spent long hours making those toys, carving details that only a father would think to include. "Their papa made these," she said, cradling the horses like they were precious jewels. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Duncan didn't press. He'd learned that grief came out in its own time, couldn't be rushed or coaxed. Instead, he focused on the stew, adding ingredients slowly and tasting as he went. It had been a long time since he'd cooked for anyone but himself, but the skills came back. The boys stirred as the smell of food filled the cabin. The one called James opened his eyes first, blinking in confusion at the unfamiliar surroundings. When he saw Duncan, he shrank back against his brother, fear replacing confusion. "It's all right," Lenora said quickly, her voice stronger now that her children were waking. "This is Mr. Macready. He's helping us." James studied Duncan with the serious expression children got when they'd seen too much of the world's harshness too early. "Are you going to hurt us?" The question hit Duncan like a physical blow. What had these children been through that a 6-year-old would ask such a thing? "No," Duncan said firmly. "I'm going to feed you, and then you're going to sleep somewhere warm and safe. That's all." David woke then, and unlike his brother, he seemed to have no fear of strangers. He sat up in the blankets and looked around the cabin with open curiosity. "This is a nice house," he announced solemnly. "We've been sleeping outside for a long time." "How long?" Duncan asked. Lenora answered when the boys just looked confused. 6 weeks, maybe more. "We left our homestead in November when She glanced at her children and chose her words carefully. "When it became unsafe to stay." Duncan stirred the stew and tried not to think too hard about what could make a woman take 2 young children out into a Colorado winter. Nothing good, that much was certain. He'd seen enough violence in the war and its aftermath to know that sometimes running into the wilderness was the safer choice. The stew was ready, thin but hot and fragrant. Duncan ladled it into bowls and carried them to his small table. Lenora helped her boys to the chairs, wrapping them in blankets like small emperors holding court. "Go slow," she warned them. "Small bites." Duncan watched the twins eat, noting how they handled their spoons with careful precision despite their obvious hunger. Good children raised right. Their mother had done well by them, even in circumstances that would have broken lesser people. When the boys had finished their first bowls and were working on seconds, Duncan finally addressed the elephant in the room. "What you said outside," he began, keeping his voice low so the children couldn't hear. "About being mine. You don't owe me anything like that. Food and shelter aren't debts that need paying with." "I meant it," Lenora interrupted, meeting his eyes directly. "I have nothing left to give except my life and my labor. If that's what it takes to keep my boys alive, then it's yours." Duncan felt something twist in his chest. 8 years of solitude had made him forget how desperate the world could be for those without the luxury of choosing isolation. This woman had made the hardest bargain a person could make, trading her freedom for her children's lives. "You don't understand," he said. I'm not looking for—" "I understand perfectly," Lenora said quietly. "You're a good man who saved us when you didn't have to. But good men are rare, and kindness has to be paid for somehow. I won't take charity." There was steel in her voice despite her exhaustion, a pride that reminded Duncan of his Marie. His wife had been the same way, fiercely independent, determined to pull her own weight no matter what. "Then we'll figure out something," he said finally. "But not tonight. Tonight you rest." The boys were nodding off in their chairs, bellies full for the first time in days. Duncan carried them back to his bed, tucking them under the heavy quilts his grandmother had made decades ago. They curled together like puppies, and for the first time since he'd found them, Duncan thought they might actually survive. Lenora watched him tend her children with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but something else underneath. Relief, maybe, at finding someone who would be gentle with what mattered most to her. "You can have the bed," Duncan said. "I'll sleep by the fire." She started to protest, but he held up a hand. "Argue with me tomorrow when you've got your strength back," he said. "Tonight you sleep." As Lenora settled beside her boys, Duncan banked the fire and laid out his bedroll near the hearth. The cabin felt different with people in it, smaller but somehow warmer. The silence that had been his companion for 8 years was broken by the soft sound of breathing, the rustle of blankets, the quiet sighs of children in safe sleep. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the storm rage outside and the peaceful sounds of the family he'd rescued from its fury. For the first time since Marie and Anna died, Duncan McCready fell asleep to the sound of other people's dreams. Dawn came grey and muffled, the storm having blown itself out sometime during the night. Duncan woke to unfamiliar sounds, the soft murmur of voices, the creak of floorboards under small feet. For a moment he lay still, disoriented by the presence of other people in his carefully ordered world. James stood at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered out at the snow-covered landscape. David sat on the floor near the fireplace, playing quietly with his wooden horse. Their mother was nowhere to be seen. Duncan sat up, immediately alert. "Where's your mama?" "She went outside," James said without turning from the window. She said she needed to see to personal business, and we weren't to bother you. Duncan pulled on his boots and coat, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The world had been transformed overnight. Snow lay 3 feet deep in places, sculpted by the wind into drifts that reached nearly to the cabin's eaves. But the sky was clear now, that particular blue that only came after mountain storms. He found Lenora behind the cabin, struggling to break ice from the water barrel with a piece of firewood. She'd wrapped one of his blankets around her shoulders like a shawl, but Duncan could see she was shivering despite the bright sunshine. "That's not how you do it," he said, taking the wood from her hands. With quick, efficient strikes, he broke through the ice layer to reach the water beneath. "Always work from the edges inward? Less chance of cracking the barrel." Lenora stepped back, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. "I didn't want to wake you. You've done enough." "I was awake." Duncan filled the bucket with fresh water and handed it to her. "How are you feeling?" "Better." She managed a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring. "The boys slept well. Thank you." They walked back to the cabin together, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Duncan noticed that Lenora moved carefully, still weak from her ordeal. It would take more than one good meal and a night's sleep to restore someone who'd been running on empty for weeks. Inside, the twins had discovered Duncan's collection of wood carvings. They sat on the floor, passing the small figures between them with reverent care. "Are these yours?" David asked, holding up a carving of a mountain lion, frozen mid-leap. "I made them," Duncan confirmed, hanging up his coat. "During the long evenings." "They're beautiful," James said softly. "Papa used to carve, too." Duncan felt that familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of their father. These boys had lost so much already. Their home, their security, their father. Yet they still found wonder in small things, still trusted enough to play with a stranger's treasures. "Would you like to learn?" Duncan asked, the words surprising him as much as the children. Both boys nodded eagerly, and Duncan found himself pulling out his carving knife and a piece of pine from his woodpile. He showed them how to hold the wood properly, how to make small, controlled cuts, how to see the shape hiding inside the raw material. Lenora watched from the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Duncan had pressed on her. "You don't have to." "I want to," Duncan said, and realized it was true. When had he last taught someone something useful? When had he last shared knowledge, instead of hoarding it like a miser? The morning passed peacefully. The boys proved quick learners, their small hands surprisingly steady as they worked on simple cuts under Duncan's watchful eye. Lenora gradually took over the domestic tasks, keeping the fire fed, preparing simple meals from Duncan's stores, organizing the small space with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making much from little. Duncan found himself watching her work, noting the careful way she handled his belongings, the quiet competence with which she managed her children and the household tasks. She didn't rearrange anything or make changes without asking, but somehow the cabin began to feel different, warmer, more alive. At midday, he took the boys outside to show them how to read the signs left by the storm, where the wind had blown strongest, where the snow was deepest, which direction the weather had come from. Basic mountain knowledge, but essential for survival. "Why do you live up here all alone?" James asked, as they examined animal tracks near the tree line. Duncan considered his answer carefully. These boys had already seen enough of life's harsh realities. They didn't need to hear about war and fever and the weight of loss that had driven him to seek solitude. "Sometimes a man needs quiet to think," he said finally. "The mountain is a good place for thinking. Are you done thinking now?" David asked with the directness that only children possessed. Duncan looked back at the cabin, where smoke rose straight and true from the chimney into the still air. Through the window, he could see Lenora moving about inside, tending to the simple tasks that turned a shelter into a home. "Maybe," he said. That evening, they sat around Duncan's table for the first real meal he'd shared with others in 8 years. It was simple fare, venison stew and cornbread, but the boys attacked it with enthusiasm, and even Lenora showed a healthy appetite for the first time since he'd found her. The conversation came easier now. The twins told him about their old home, about the chickens they'd raised, and the garden their mother had tended. Lenora added details here and there, but Duncan noticed she was careful not to mention specific places or names, still protecting herself and her children, even in safety. After supper, Duncan brought out a deck of well-worn cards and taught the boys to play simple games. Their laughter filled the cabin, bright and pure as bells. Lenora smiled as she watched them, the first genuine smile Duncan had seen from her when the boys finally fell asleep in the big bed. Lenora and Duncan sat by the fire, sharing the comfortable quiet of adults at day's end. "They like you," Lenora said softly. "They're good boys. They haven't had a man's attention since their father died. I'd forgotten how much they needed that." Duncan stirred the coals with an iron poker, sending sparks up the chimney. "How long ago?" "Last spring. The fever took him." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Duncan could hear the old grief underneath. "I tried to keep the homestead going, but," she shrugged, "a woman alone with 2 small children. There are men who see that as opportunity." Duncan felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and sudden. He'd seen enough of such men during his years in the cavalry. Predators who targeted the vulnerable and defenseless. "You don't have to worry about that here," he said. Lenora looked at him across the firelight, her dark eyes serious. "I know. That's why I meant what I said last night. About belonging to you, if you'll have us." Duncan felt the weight of that offer, the trust it represented. This woman was placing her life and her children's lives entirely in his hands, asking nothing but safety in return. "We'll figure it out," he said again, because he still wasn't sure what else to say. But as he looked at her face in the firelight, Duncan MacCready began to think that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to figure it out with someone else. The second week brought a routine that surprised Duncan with how natural it felt. He woke each morning to the sound of Lenora quietly tending the fire, her movements careful not to disturb the sleeping boys. She'd found a worn apron among his few household goods and made it her own, transforming the simple garment into something that spoke of home and hearth. On Wednesday morning, Duncan returned from checking his trap lines to find wonderful smells emerging from his kitchen. Lenora stood at the stove, stirring something in his largest pot, her hair pinned back and a flour smudge on her cheek. "What's all this?" he asked, hanging his rifle by the door. "I found your stores of dried apples and some spices," she said, not turning around. "I thought, well, I hoped you wouldn't mind if I tried making something my grandmother taught me." The boys sat at the table, watching their mother work with the focused attention of children who'd learned not to take good food for granted. Duncan washed his hands and joined them, breathing in aromas that carried him back to his childhood: cinnamon, nutmeg, the sweet richness of fruit cooked with care. "Mama makes the best apple dumplings in all of Kansas," James announced proudly. "Kansas?" Duncan asked, filing away this small piece of information about their past. Lenora's shoulders tensed slightly, but she didn't correct her son. "My grandmother's recipe. She brought it from Pennsylvania when she was a bride." When she served the dumplings, Duncan understood the boy's enthusiasm. The pastry was light and flaky, the apples tender and sweet with spices. It was the kind of food that spoke of tradition, of recipes passed down through generations of women who understood that feeding people was an act of love. "This is remarkable," Duncan said, and watched color rise in Lenora's cheeks at the compliment. "It's just simple cooking. Nothing fancy. Best meal I've had in years," Duncan said honestly. "Thank you." That afternoon, while the boys napped, Duncan found himself working alongside Lenora as she mended their travel-worn clothes. She'd asked to borrow his sewing kit and had spent the morning carefully repairing tears and reinforcing weak seams. "You don't have to do all this," Duncan said, watching her neat, precise stitches. "I need to pull my weight," Lenora replied without looking up from her work. "I won't be a burden. You're not a burden. None of you are." She set down her needle and looked at him directly. "What are we then? Guests' charity cases? You can't feed us and shelter us indefinitely without it costing you something." Duncan considered his words carefully. The question of their future hung between them, unspoken but always present. What would happen when spring came, when the snow melted and the trails became passable again? "You're people who needed help," he said finally. Good people. That's enough for now. And later? Later we'll figure out later. Lenora smiled at that, a small private expression that transformed her face. You say that a lot. It's served me well so far. That evening, Duncan taught the boys to play chess using a set he'd carved himself years earlier. They proved quick students, grasping the basic moves with the rapid learning ability of childhood. James favored aggressive, direct attacks, while David preferred careful, methodical play that reminded Duncan of seasoned military strategists. Where did you learn to play? Lenora asked, watching from her chair by the fire where she was working on yet another mending project. My father taught me. Said it was good training for thinking ahead, seeing consequences. Was he a military man? Duncan moved his bishop to counter James's enthusiastic cavalry charge. Banker, actually. But he'd fought in the Mexican War when he was young. Always said a man needed to understand strategy, whether he was planning a battle or managing money. Do you miss it? Your old life? The question caught Duncan off guard. He'd grown so accustomed to not talking about his past that discussing it felt strange, like speaking a half-remembered language. Sometimes, he admitted, I miss the parts that were good. Don't miss the parts that weren't. Lenora nodded as if she understood perfectly, which Duncan supposed she did. Anyone who'd fled into the wilderness with 2 small children clearly knew something about leaving painful things behind. As the week progressed, small changes accumulated in the cabin. Lenora had a gift for organization, finding better ways to arrange Duncan's belongings without changing their essential character. His books were still on their shelves, but now they were sorted by size and subject. His tools hung in the same places, but they were cleaner, better maintained. Most noticeably, she'd begun cooking from a small leather journal she carried in her traveling bag. Duncan glimpsed pages covered with neat handwriting, recipes, he assumed, and passed down through generations of women who'd made homes wherever they found themselves. My grandmother's book, she confirmed when she caught him looking. She gave it to me when I married. Said a woman could make a home anywhere if she had good recipes and the will to use them. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Came west in a covered wagon when she was 18. Raised 7 children. Lost 3 to various illnesses, and lived to see great-grandchildren born. She used to say that life would test you in ways you couldn't imagine, but as long as you could feed your family, you'd find a way to survive anything. Duncan thought about that as he watched Lenora work. There was something almost sacred in the way she prepared meals, the careful attention she paid to making simple ingredients into something nourishing and good. She was keeping faith with the women who'd come before her, honoring their memory by caring for the people in front of her. The boys, meanwhile, were thriving in ways that went beyond mere physical recovery. Their cheeks had filled out, their eyes had regained their sparkle, and they'd begun to play with the careless abandon of children who felt truly safe. Duncan often found them building elaborate forts from his firewood or staging complex battles with the carved animals from his collection. But it was the quieter moments that affected Duncan most deeply. James falling asleep against his shoulder during evening stories. David's serious questions about mountain wildlife and weather patterns. Lenora's soft singing as she worked, melodies that filled the cabin with warmth, more effective than any fire. On Sunday evening, as they sat around the table playing cards, James looked up at Duncan with sudden seriousness. "Are you going to be our papa now?" he asked. The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Duncan felt Lenora's eyes on him, waiting for his answer. David stopped arranging his cards and looked between the adults with the watchful stillness children got when they sensed important things being decided. "Would you like that?" Duncan asked carefully. Both boys nodded eagerly, but it was Lenora's barely perceptible nod that made Duncan's heart skip a beat. The 3rd week brought weather so cold that even stepping outside for firewood left a man's lungs burning and his fingers numb despite thick gloves. The windows frosted over completely, turning the cabin into a cozy cave lit by firelight and the warm glow of oil lamps. Outside, the wind howled like something wild and hungry. But inside, the family, for that's what Duncan had begun to think of them as, settled into the kind of close-quarters contentment that only came from being truly safe together. It was during one of these long, storm-bound evenings that Lenora accidentally discovered Duncan's military past. She'd been looking for extra blankets in his storage chest when her fingers found something hard wrapped in oiled cloth. Before she could stop herself, she'd unwrapped a tarnished cavalry medal. Its ribbon faded, but the bronze still showing traces of its original shine. Duncan looked up from where he was teaching the boys to whittle and froze when he saw what she held. "I'm sorry," Lenora said quickly, starting to rewrap the medal. "I wasn't prying. I was just looking for—" "It's all right." Duncan set down his knife and held out his hand. She placed the medal in his palm, and he studied it as if he hadn't seen it in years, which Duncan realized he probably hadn't. 3rd Colorado Cavalry, served from 62 to 65. The boys looked up from their wood shavings, suddenly interested. "You were a soldier?" James asked, his eyes wide. "I was." Duncan turned the medal over in his hands, remembering the young man who'd earned it. "Fought in Tennessee and Georgia mostly, chasing Confederate raiders, protecting supply lines. Did you kill anybody?" David asked with the matter-of-fact curiosity of childhood. Duncan glanced at Lenora, but she nodded slightly, trusting him to handle the question appropriately. "War is a terrible thing," Duncan said carefully. "Sometimes men have to do things they'd never choose to do to protect what matters to them. I did my duty, but I was always glad when the fighting stopped." "Is that why you came to the mountains?" Lenora asked. "Because of the war?" Duncan was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he was seeing things that existed only in memory. "Partly. The war taught me things about myself I wish I'd never learned. About how much violence one man could live with, how thin the line was between civilization and savagery. When I came home, I thought I could settle back into peaceful life. Got married, started a family." He stopped, his throat working. "What happened?" Lenora asked gently. "Fever epidemic in the mining camps. Killed my wife Marie and our daughter Anna in the same week. I buried them both, sold everything I owned, and came up here to get away from—" He gestured vaguely. "From everything." The silence that followed was broken only by the crack and pop of the fire. The boys had stopped their whittling, sensing the weight of adult pain, even if they didn't fully understand it. "How long ago?" Lenora asked. 8 years last October. "And you've been alone all this time?" Duncan nodded, suddenly embarrassed by the admission. 8 years of solitude seemed excessive when said out loud, especially to a woman who'd fought to keep her family together despite impossible odds. "I'm sorry," Lenora said, "for your losses. It must have been terrible." "It was." Duncan looked at her across the firelight, seeing understanding in her dark eyes. "But I survived it." "That's what people do, they survive." "Yes," she said quietly, "they do." That night, after the boys were asleep, Duncan and Lenora sat by the dying fire and talked in the way people did when they'd shared something important. She told him about her own losses, her husband's death from fever the previous spring, the struggle to keep their small homestead running, the men who'd begun to see a widow with property as an opportunity for profit or worse. "Thomas was a good man," she said, speaking of her late husband. "Gentle with the boys, patient with my moods. He deserved better than fever and an early grave." "What made you leave Kansas?" Lenora's expression hardened. "A man named Hutchins decided I needed a husband to help manage my affairs. When I refused his generous offer, he made it clear that my refusal wasn't acceptable. Started coming around at night, making threats, letting his hired men graze their cattle in my garden. I held out as long as I could, but when he threatened the boys, she didn't need to finish. Duncan could fill in the rest easily enough. A woman alone with 2 small children had few options when faced with that kind of pressure. "You did the right thing," Duncan said. "Running took courage." "Did it? Sometimes I think I should have stayed and fought. Found some way to protect what Thomas built for us. And gotten yourself and your boys killed in the process." Duncan shook his head. "No, you chose the hard path that kept your family alive. That's what good mothers do." Lenora was quiet for a long moment, staring into the coals. I keep thinking about what happens when spring comes. When the snow melts and the trails are clear again. What do you want to happen? I want to stay, she said simply. Here with you. But I know that's not fair to ask. You didn't choose this. We just fell into your life like snow through a broken roof. Duncan considered her words. A month ago, he would have been counting the days until spring, planning how to help them find somewhere else to go. But now the thought of the cabin empty again, silent again, filled him with something close to dread. What if I wanted you to stay? He asked. Lenora looked at him sharply. Do you? I think I might. It wasn't a declaration of love, wasn't even a clear statement of intent, but it was honest, which seemed important. Duncan had learned that honesty was the only foundation strong enough to build a life on. The boys need stability, Lenora said. A home, a father figure, someone to teach them the things their papa would have taught them. And you, what do you need? She was quiet for so long that Duncan thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I need to feel safe. I need to know that my children will be protected. And I need... She stopped, shaking her head. What? I need to matter to someone again. To be more than just a burden or a responsibility. She met his eyes. I know that's selfish. It's not selfish. It's human. Duncan reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. Her fingers were small and work roughened, but they were warm and real and alive. After 8 years of touching nothing but tools and wood and stone, the simple contact felt like coming home. We'll figure it out, he said again. But this time, the words carried a different weight. This time, they sounded like a promise. The 4th week brought an unexpected softness to their routine, as if the admission of feelings had given them permission to become something more than survivors sharing space. Duncan found himself looking forward to moments he'd never valued before. The sound of Lenora humming as she worked. The boys' excited chatter about their latest wood-carving projects. The comfortable silences that fell over the cabin in the evenings. Christmas was approaching. Though none of them had mentioned it directly, Duncan had stopped marking holidays years ago, finding them too painful to bear alone. But watching the boys discover icicles hanging from the cabin's eaves like nature's own decorations, he began to think that perhaps Christmas didn't have to be about grief and memory. On a particularly bright morning, when the sun turned the snow-covered landscape into something that belonged in a fairy tale, James made an announcement that changed everything. "Mama," he said, looking up from the wooden bird he was attempting to carve, "can we make Christmas here?" Lenora paused in her mending, her needle suspended halfway through a seam. Duncan felt her tension from across the room, understanding instinctively that holidays carried their own weight of memory and loss. "I don't know if Mr. Macready celebrates Christmas." "Sweetheart," she said carefully. Duncan set down his coffee cup, aware that 3 pairs of eyes were watching him. The boys looked hopeful, but prepared for disappointment, an expression that broke his heart more than any pleading could have. "What does making Christmas involve?" he asked. David's face lit up like sunrise. "Well, Papa always cut down a tree, and Mama would make decorations from corn husks and ribbon. And we'd have a big dinner with sweet potatoes and pie. And sometimes, if we'd been very good, there might be small presents. Mama tells the story of baby Jesus," James added. "And we sing songs." Duncan looked at Lenora, who was watching him with an expression of careful hope. "What do you think?" he asked her. "The boys have had so little joy this year," she said quietly. "If it wouldn't be too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Duncan said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "But we'll need that tree. Boys want to help me find one?" The expedition to find a Christmas tree became an adventure that filled the entire morning. Duncan showed the twins how to read the forest, how to identify different types of evergreens, how to judge which trees would fit through the cabin door. They settled on a blue spruce, about 6 feet tall, perfectly shaped and fragrant, with the clean scent of mountain wilderness. Getting the tree back to the cabin proved almost as entertaining as finding it. The boys took turns helping drag it through the snow, their laughter echoing off the mountainsides. Duncan found himself laughing too, caught up in their infectious enthusiasm. Lenora met them at the door with hot cider spiced with cinnamon and cloves, another of her grandmother's recipes, she explained. They spent the afternoon figuring out how to stand the tree in Duncan's largest cooking pot, weighted with stones from the creek. Now for decorations, Lenora said, pulling her small traveling bag closer. From it, she withdrew treasures Duncan hadn't known she possessed: carefully preserved ribbon, a small collection of buttons, needles and thread, and most surprisingly, a family Bible bound in worn brown leather. My grandmother's Bible, she explained, seeing Duncan's interested look. She pressed flowers in it during the journey west. Look. She opened the book carefully, revealing pages marked with delicate pressed wildflowers, prairie roses, Indian paintbrush, mountain lupine. Some were so old they crumbled at a touch, but others retained hints of their original colors. She said the flowers helped her remember beautiful things during the hard times, Lenora said. When things got difficult on the trail, she'd open the Bible and look at the flowers and remember that there was still beauty in the world. Duncan touched one of the pressed roses with careful fingers. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. She's the one who taught me that a family could make a home anywhere. As long as they had love and faith and the will to keep trying, they worked together through the afternoon, creating decorations from whatever materials they could find. Lenora showed the boys how to fashion stars from corn husks, while Duncan carved small ornaments from pine scraps. They strung popped corn and berries, creating garlands that filled the cabin with festive color. As evening approached, Duncan found himself alone with Lenora, while the boys napped in the big bed. She was working on a final decoration, a small angel carved from a piece of white pine, delicate and ethereal. "You're very skilled," Duncan said, watching her nimble fingers shape the angel's robes. "My father taught me. He was a carpenter before he became a farmer." She looked up from her work. "This feels strange, celebrating Christmas. This is the first one since Thomas died. Are you all right with it? We could—" "No," she said quickly. "I want this. The boys need this. And I think Thomas would want them to have joy again. He loved Christmas. Always made such a production of it." Duncan moved closer, drawn by something in her voice. "Tell me about him." Lenora smiled, a soft expression that transformed her face. "He was gentle, patient with the boys when they got into mischief, kind to animals, generous with what little we had. He used to say that every day above ground was a gift, especially when you had people to share it with. He sounds like a good man." He was. "And he loved us completely without reservation." She met Duncan's eyes. "I never doubted that. Even when he was dying, his biggest worry was what would happen to us after he was gone." Duncan felt the weight of that love, the responsibility Thomas had carried and passed on. "He'd be glad to know you're safe now, that the boys are thriving, would he?" Lenora set down her carving and looked at Duncan directly. "Would he be glad to know I'm falling in love with someone else?" The words hung in the air between them, honest and brave and terrifying. Duncan felt his heart race as he absorbed what she'd said, not just the admission of love, but the trust it represented. "I think," Duncan said carefully, "that a man who loved you that much would want you to be happy, would want his sons to have a father who'd protect and care for them. And are you that man?" Duncan reached out and touched her cheek, feeling the softness of her skin under his calloused palm. "I'd like to be, if you'll let me try." Lenora leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them again, Duncan saw something that took his breath away. Not just love, but trust. Complete, absolute trust. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I." Duncan leaned down and kissed her then, soft and careful and full of promise. It was his first kiss in 8 years, and it tasted like hope and second chances and the possibility of family restored. When they broke apart, Lenora rested her forehead against his chest, and Duncan held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and the miracle of holding someone again. "Merry Christmas." "Duncan," she whispered, "Merry Christmas." Lenora, outside the wind began to pick up again, promising another storm. But inside the cabin, warmed by love and decorated with hope, Duncan McCready's family prepared to celebrate their first Christmas together. The stranger arrived on the worst day possible. Duncan was in the barn he'd built behind the cabin, splitting firewood while the boys played in the snow nearby. The morning had started peaceful, Lenora humming Christmas carols as she prepared. Breakfast, the twins excited about the presents Duncan had been secretly carving for them. Then the wind had picked up, bringing with it the scent of another storm and the sound that made Duncan's blood freeze. Hoofbeats. No one traveled these mountains in winter unless they were running from something or chasing it. Duncan sat down, his axe, and moved to the barn door, motioning for the boys to come closer. Through the swirling snow, he could make out a single rider, hunched over his horse's neck, fighting through the drifts that had accumulated during the night. The man was nearly done in. That much was obvious, even from a distance. His horse stumbled with exhaustion, and the rider swayed in the saddle like someone who'd been traveling far too long in dangerous conditions. Common decency demanded that Duncan offer shelter, even if every instinct screamed warning. "Boys," Duncan said quietly, "go inside and tell your mother we have company. Tell her to stay close to the rifle." James and David exchanged worried glances, but obeyed without question. They'd learned to read the tension in adult voices, to understand when playing time was over. The rider made it to the cabin and practically fell from his saddle. Duncan approached carefully, one hand resting on the knife at his belt. The man was young, maybe 25, with the lean build of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. His clothes were good quality, but travel-stained, and despite his exhaustion, his eyes held the alert wariness of someone accustomed to trouble. "Help you?" Duncan asked. "Storm caught me," the stranger said, his voice hoarse with cold and fatigue. "My horse is about done in. I can pay for shelter." Duncan studied the man's face, looking for signs of deception or danger. What he saw was genuine exhaustion and the kind of bone-deep cold that could kill a man if left untreated. "Bring your horse around back," Duncan said finally. "There's space in the barn. We'll get you warmed up." The stranger nodded gratefully and led his mount toward the shelter. Duncan followed, noting the quality of the horse's tack and the bulge of what looked like saddlebags stuffed with more than traveling supplies. Either this man was wealthy, or he was carrying something valuable. Inside the cabin, Lenora had the coffee hot and the rifle within easy reach. The boys sat at the table, their earlier excitement replaced by the watchful, quiet children learned when strange men appeared unexpectedly. "Name's Peters," the stranger said, accepting the cup of coffee with hands that shook from cold. "Can't tell you how grateful I am. Was starting to think I'd freeze to death out there." Duncan introduced himself and his family, watching Peter's face for any sign of recognition. The man seemed focused entirely on warming up, but Duncan noticed how his eyes catalogued the cabin's contents, the number of people present, the location of weapons. "What brings you up this way in winter?" Duncan asked. "Not exactly traveling weather." Peters hesitated, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup. "I'm a bounty hunter, chasing a fugitive who's been giving me the slip for months. Trail led up this way, but with the storm," he shrugged. "Figure I'll have to wait until spring to pick up the scent again." Duncan felt Lenora stiffen beside him. When he glanced at her, her face had gone pale, and she was staring at Peters with something close to panic. "What kind of fugitive?" Duncan asked, keeping his voice casual. Peters reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Wanted for questioning in connection with a series of bank robberies in Kansas. The whole gang's been scattered to the wind, but there's still a few outstanding warrants." He unfolded the paper, revealing a wanted poster with a sketch that made Duncan's heart stop. The face was rougher, more masculine, but the bone structure was unmistakable. It was Lenora's face, drawn as if she were a man, but that wasn't what made Duncan's blood turn to ice. It was the name at the bottom of the poster, Thomas McKinnon, also known as Tommy the Kid. "Wanted dead or alive, $500 reward." Peters was studying the poster, then looking around the cabin again. His gaze settled on Lenora, who had gone absolutely still. "Funny thing," Peters said slowly. "I've been tracking this McKinnon fellow for months, And I keep hearing stories about a woman and two boys who've been seen in the area where he was last spotted. Woman matches the description of his wife. He looked directly at Lenora. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, ma'am? The silence in the cabin was deafening. Duncan could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the tension radiating from Lenora like heat from a fire. The boys sensed something wrong but didn't understand what. I think there's been a mistake, Duncan said carefully. Peters smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I don't think so. See, I've got a good memory for faces, and this lady here, he nodded toward Lenora. She's got the same bone structure as the woman in the witness descriptions, and those boys, they'd be about the right age for McKinnon's twin sons. Lenora finally found her voice. My husband is dead. He died of fever last spring. Oh, I know Tommy McKinnon is dead, Peters said. Shot down during a robbery gone wrong in Dodge City last October. What I want to know is where he hid the money from the previous jobs, and I'm thinking his widow might have some ideas about that. Duncan felt the world shift around him. Everything he thought he knew about Lenora's past was suddenly in question. Her husband hadn't been a simple farmer who died of fever. He'd been an outlaw, killed in the commission of a crime. The gentle man she'd described, the loving father who carved toys for his boys, had been living a double life. I don't know anything about any money, Lenora said, her voice steady despite her obvious terror. Peters laughed. Sure you don't. That's why you've been running across 3 states with 2 small children in the middle of winter. Just felt like taking a little vacation, did you? Duncan moved slightly, positioning himself between Peters and his family. The bounty hunter noticed the movement, and his hand drifted toward his gun. Now don't do anything stupid, Peters said. I've got no quarrel with you, McCready. Just want to ask the lady some questions. Maybe take her back to Kansas to clear up this whole misunderstanding. She's not going anywhere, Duncan said quietly. Peters' eyes hardened. This isn't your business, Mountain Man. This woman is wanted in connection with multiple felonies. I've got legal authority to take her into custody. Do you? Duncan asked. Because that poster you showed me has her husband's name on it, not hers. And last I checked, being married to an outlaw wasn't a crime. She knows where the money is. The gang hit 5 banks before McKinnon got himself killed. Took nearly $20,000, and most of it's never been recovered. $20,000. Duncan understood now why Peters had been so persistent, why he'd risked winter travel in dangerous country. That kind of money could set a man up for life. Lenora stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance. Even if I knew where some money was hidden, which I don't, what makes you think I'd tell you? You're not the law. You're just a vulture picking at the bones of dead men. Peters' face flushed with anger. Dead men don't need money, lady. But live women with children to feed, well, that's different. Tell me what I want to know, and maybe we can work out some arrangement. The threat was clear enough. Duncan felt rage building in his chest, hot and familiar. He'd known men like Peters during the war, opportunists who saw other people's misfortune as their own chance for profit. Time for you to leave, Duncan said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd led cavalry charges against armed enemies. Peters stood up slowly, his hand resting on his gun butt. Can't do that, not until I get what I came for. Then I guess we have a problem, Duncan said. Outside, the wind howled louder, promising a storm that would trap them all together. Inside, the cabin, Duncan McCready faced the first real test of his commitment to the woman he'd grown to love and the children he'd promised to protect. The standoff stretched through the longest night of Duncan's life. Peters had agreed to wait out the storm. He had little choice. With the wind howling at 60 miles per hour and snow falling so thick, a man could get lost between the cabin and the barn. But his agreement came with conditions. He kept his gun within easy reach and made it clear that come morning, he expected answers about the missing money and Thomas McKinnon's widow. Duncan had positioned himself strategically near his rifle, while Lenora kept the boys close, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. They played quiet games, spoke in whispers, and tried to pretend that the dangerous stranger by their fire wasn't planning to destroy their newfound family. When the boys finally fell asleep, exhausted by tension, they didn't understand. The real conversation began. "Might as well tell me the truth now," Peter said, settling back in his chair with his coffee and his gun equally close at hand. "I've got all night, and I'm a patient man when there's money involved." Lenora looked at Duncan, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, fear, guilt, and a desperate need to be understood. "You want the truth?" she said finally. "Fine. Yes, Thomas was involved with that gang. But not by choice, not at first," Peter snorted. "They never are, according to their wives." "Listen to me," Lenora said, steel entering her voice. "My husband was a carpenter, a good man, trying to build a life for his family. But times were hard after the war. Work was scarce. And we had debts, medical bills, from when the boys were born early and nearly died." Duncan felt pieces falling into place, understanding beginning to replace the shock of betrayal. "A man named Hutchins owned the bank that held our mortgage," Lenora continued. "He also ran a gambling operation and some other less savory businesses. When Thomas couldn't make the payments, Hutchins offered him a choice: lose the farm and watch his family starve, or do some carpentry work for his organization. Build hiding places, make modifications to wagons, that sort of thing. And that led to bank robbery?" Peters asked skeptically. "Thomas never robbed any banks," Lenora said firmly. "But he built the false bottoms in the wagons where they hid the money. He made the secret compartments in their hideouts. He was their carpenter, not their gunman. But he knew about the robberies, yes, and it ate at him every day. He kept saying he'd find a way out, that he'd save enough money to pay off Hutchins and get clear. But men like Hutchins don't let go of useful assets easily." Duncan watched Peter's face, seeing the calculation there. The bounty hunter was weighing the story, looking for profit angles. "So where's the money?" Peters asked. "I don't know," Lenora said. "Thomas never told me where they kept their stolen goods. Said it was safer if I didn't know. The only thing he ever said was that if something happened to him, I should take the boys and run as far and as fast as I could." "And you expect me to believe that?" Peters laughed. "A man doesn't keep that kind of secret from his wife. $20,000. That's enough to set up anywhere, live like royalty." "You're telling me he never mentioned where it was?" "He was protecting us," Lenora said. "He knew that if anyone ever came looking for that money, they'd use me and the boys to get to it. So he made sure we couldn't tell them anything, even if we wanted to." Duncan found himself believing her. It matched the character of the man she'd described: gentle, protective, willing to sacrifice for his family. Thomas McKinnon had been caught in an impossible situation and had done his best to shield his loved ones from the consequences. But Peters wasn't buying it. "Maybe he didn't tell you directly. But husbands talk, especially to wives they trust. Maybe he mentioned places he'd been, things he'd seen, people he'd met. Maybe he brought home more money than his carpentry should have earned. He never—" "Or maybe," Peters continued, his voice growing harder, "maybe you know exactly where that money is, and you've been sitting on it, waiting for things to cool down before you went back for it." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Duncan saw Lenora's face go white with anger. "How dare you?" she whispered. "Do you think I'd let my children starve, let them nearly freeze to death if I had access to thousands of dollars? Do you think I'd put them through what they've been through if I had any other choice?" Peters studied her face, looking for tells, for signs of deception. Duncan watched him work and felt a growing certainty that the bounty hunter was going to conclude that Lenora was lying, regardless of the evidence. "Maybe you couldn't get to it," Peters said finally. "Maybe it's hidden somewhere you can't reach safely. Maybe you need help, professional help, from someone who knows how to handle these situations." "You mean help from someone willing to split the profits," Duncan said. Peter smiled. "I'm a businessman, McCready. I find solutions that work for everyone. The lady needs protection. I need information. We could work something out. And if she truly doesn't know anything—" The bounty hunter's smile faded. "Then we'll have to explore other methods of refreshing her memory." The threat was unmistakable. Duncan felt his military training kick in. his mind automatically cataloging weapons, exits, defensive positions. Peters was armed and dangerous, but he was also overconfident. He thought he was dealing with a simple mountain hermit and a frightened woman. He had no idea that Duncan MacReady had spent 3 years learning how to kill armed men who were trying to kill him. As the night wore on, Duncan began to formulate a plan. Peters would have to sleep eventually. He was human, and he'd been traveling hard before the storm hit. When he did, Duncan would make his move. But it had to be clean, quiet, and permanent. The bounty hunter had seen too much, knew too much. Even if they convinced him that Lenora truly didn't know where the money was, he'd never stop looking for angles to exploit. Around midnight, Lenora excused herself to check on the boys. Duncan heard her moving around the bed, tucking blankets, whispering comfort. When she returned, she carried something concealed in her skirts. "Mr. Peters," she said softly, "may I show you something?" The bounty hunter looked up from the fire, instantly alert. "What?" Lenora reached into her pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. She opened it and poured the contents onto the table. A handful of coins, maybe $3 total. "This is everything I have left in the world," she said. $3.14. "If I knew where Thomas hid thousands of dollars, do you really think I'd be carrying this pathetic amount?" Peters examined the coins, counting them. Duncan watched his face, seeing doubt creep in for the first time. "Maybe you spent the rest," Peters said, but his voice lacked conviction. "On what?" "Look at my clothes. Look at my children's clothes. Everything we own could fit in one small bag. We've been living on charity and whatever food I could gather along the trail. Does this look like the lifestyle of someone with access to stolen bank money?" Duncan had to admire her strategy. The evidence was compelling. Their obvious poverty, their desperate condition when he'd found them, the fact that she'd been willing to trade her life for her children's survival. No one with thousands of dollars hidden away would have been reduced to such extremes. Peters was wavering. Duncan could see it. The bounty hunter had invested so much time and effort in this chase that he didn't want to admit he'd been wrong. But the evidence was mounting that Lenora truly didn't have access to the missing money. "There's something else," Lenora said quietly. "Something I haven't told you about Thomas." Both men looked at her sharply. "He came home one night, about a month before he died, in a state I'd never seen before. Shaking, crying, barely able to speak. Something had happened during a job. I never found out what, but it had broken something inside him. He swore to me that he was done with Hutchins and his gang, that he'd rather lose everything than be part of what they were doing." She paused, her voice catching with remembered pain. 3 days later, he rode out to tell them he was through. That's when he got the fever that killed him, caught it from someone in the gang's camp. He never came home healthy again. Peters was quiet, processing this new information. Duncan could see the calculation going on behind his eyes. If Thomas McKinnon had broken with the gang before he died, if he'd never participated in the final robberies, then his widow truly might not know anything useful. "Even if that's true," Peters said finally, "there are still people looking for that money. People who won't be as reasonable as me." It was then that Duncan realized the full scope of their problem. Peters wasn't just a lone bounty hunter. He was the advance scout for something much worse. Other men would follow, men with fewer scruples and less patience. "Who else is looking?" Duncan asked, though he dreaded the answer. Peters hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty might serve his purposes better than threats. "What's left of McKinnon's gang, for starters? They think he double-crossed them, hid their share somewhere before he died. There's also a detective from the Pinkerton agency. The banks want their money back, and they're willing to pay well for results. And you're working with them." "I'm working for me," Peters said. "But yeah, I've been sharing information with the Pinkertons. They've got resources I don't." Duncan felt ice forming in his veins. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was legendary for its ruthlessness and persistence. They'd tracked outlaws across continents, infiltrated organizations, used any means necessary to get results. If they were involved, this wouldn't end with one bounty hunter in a mountain cabin. "How did you find us?" Lenora asked. "Wasn't hard. Woman traveling alone with twin boys, heading west from Kansas. You left quite a trail. Store clerks remember you, especially when you were buying supplies with silver dollars instead of paper money. Duncan saw Lenora flinch at that. Silver dollars were uncommon among ordinary settlers, more likely to be found in bank robbery proceeds than in a poor widow's purse. Those were Thomas's savings, she said quietly. He always preferred silver to paper, said it held its value better. Maybe, or maybe they were part of his share from earlier jobs. Peters leaned forward. Look, Mrs. McKinnon, I'm not unreasonable. You help me find some of that money, even a small portion, and I'll make sure word gets out that you cooperated. Might keep the others from bothering you. And if I can't help you find something that doesn't exist? Peter's expression hardened again. Then I guess we'll have to wait for the others to arrive. See if their methods of persuasion are more effective than mine. The threat crystallized Duncan's resolve. This man was never going to leave them alone, never going to accept that Lenora truly didn't know where any stolen money was hidden. And worse, he'd brought other hunters to their trail, hunters who might be even more dangerous. Duncan stood up slowly, moving to add wood to the fire. As he bent over the woodpile, his hand closed around the handle of the splitting axe he'd left there earlier. In one smooth motion, he straightened and turned. The axe balanced in his grip. Peters saw the movement and reached for his gun, but Duncan was already moving, his cavalry training taking over. He threw the axe with the precision of a man who'd learned to make every motion count in battle. The heavy blade buried itself in the wooden wall, inches from Peters's head. The bounty hunter froze, his half-drawn pistol trembling in his hand. Next one won't miss, Duncan said quietly. Now, set that gun on the table and push it away. Peters hesitated, calculating odds, looking for advantages. Duncan could read his thoughts. The mountain man had thrown an axe with incredible accuracy, but now he was unarmed, across the room from his rifle. But Peters didn't know about the knife. Marie's knife, worn at Duncan's belt for 8 years, sharp enough to shave with and balanced for throwing. He'd practiced with it countless hours during the lonely mountain evenings, keeping skills honed that he'd hoped never to need again. Don't test me, Duncan said, his hand moving casually toward his belt. I've killed men before, and I'll do it again to protect my family. Something in his voice, the calm certainty of a man who'd faced death and dealt it, convinced Peters. He set his pistol on the table and pushed it toward the center, well out of his reach. Smart choice, Duncan said. He retrieved the axe from the wall and collected Peters's gun, checking the loads before tucking it into his own belt. Now what? Peters asked. Duncan looked at Lenora, who was watching him with an expression of amazed gratitude. Now we wait for morning, and then we figure out how to keep you and your friends from ever bothering my family again. You can't kill me, Peters said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. People know where I went. When I don't report back, who says anything about killing you? Duncan smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. There are lots of ways to make a man disappear in these mountains. Ways that don't involve killing, but guarantee he's never found. Peters went pale, understanding flooding his face. Mountain winters were unforgiving. A man without proper supplies, without knowledge of the terrain, without shelter, such a man could vanish completely, leaving no trace for anyone to follow. You wouldn't, Peters whispered. For them. Duncan looked at the sleeping boys, at Lenora's grateful face. I'd do worse. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin the balance of power had shifted completely. Duncan McCready had made his choice, declared his allegiance, drawn his line in the snow. Now all that remained was to defend it. Dawn brought the sound Duncan had been dreading. More hoofbeats cutting through the crisp mountain air. He'd spent the night watching Peters, dozing fitfully in his chair with one hand on his rifle. The bounty hunter had tried to sleep, but kept starting awake, apparently realizing that unconsciousness in the presence of an armed man who'd threatened him wasn't the wisest choice. Lenora had gotten the boys up early, fed them quickly, and taken them to the root cellar Duncan had carved beneath the cabin's floorboards. It was a hiding place he'd prepared years ago, thinking mainly of severe weather or potential threats from wild animals. He'd never imagined it would be needed to protect his family from human predators. How many? Peters asked, hearing the horses as clearly as Duncan did. Duncan moved to the window, staying to one side as he peered through the glass. 3 riders approached through the snow, their mounts picking their way carefully up the slope toward the cabin. Even at a distance, Duncan could see they were better armed and equipped than Peters had been. "Professional men, used to violence, friends of yours?" Duncan asked. Peters had gone pale, apparently recognizing something about the approaching riders that frightened him more than Duncan's threats. "Not friends, competition. The gang members you mentioned. Worse, Pinkertons." Duncan felt his blood chill. Pinkerton agents had a reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness that made army cavalry look gentle. These weren't men who'd be turned back by threats or intimidated by mountain hermit tactics. The lead rider called out as they approached, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Peters, you in there?" Duncan looked at the bounty hunter, who seemed to be weighing his options. Finally, Peters answered, "I'm here. With the woman." "Good. We're coming in." Duncan moved quickly to the root cellar, lifting the concealed trap-door that led to the space beneath the cabin. Lenora looked up at him from the darkness below, her boys pressed close against her sides. "Pinkertons," he said quietly. 3 of them. "Stay down here no matter what you hear. Don't come up until I call for you specifically. Duncan, I know what I'm doing." He hoped that was true. "Trust me." The cellar door closed just as the cabin door opened without ceremony. The 3 Pinkerton agents entered like they owned the place, their weapons drawn, and their eyes cataloguing everything in the room. The leader was a tall man in his 40s, well-dressed despite the harsh travel conditions. His companions flanked him professionally, covering different angles, ready for trouble. These weren't bounty hunters chasing easy money. These were experienced manhunters who'd tracked dangerous prey across the continent. "Mr. McCready, I presume," the leader said, his voice cultured Eastern. "I'm Detective Morrison, Pinkerton Agency. This is Detective Hayes and Detective Garrett." Duncan kept his rifle ready, but not directly threatening. "Gentlemen, we understand you've been harboring Mrs. Thomas McKinnon and her children. I've been providing shelter to a woman and her boys who were caught in a blizzard." Morrison smiled thinly. "Of course. Christian charity. Admirable quality in a man." His expression hardened. "Where is she?" "Somewhere safe, I'm sure. But we need to speak with her about her late husband's activities, specifically about approximately $18,000 in stolen bank funds that have never been recovered." 18,000. Duncan noted that the amount had dropped from Peters's claimed 20,000. Interesting how stories changed depending on who was telling them. "The woman doesn't know anything about stolen money," Duncan said. "Perhaps. But we'll need to verify that through our own questioning methods." The threat was polite but unmistakable. Duncan had heard about Pinkerton interrogation techniques. They weren't bound by the same legal constraints as regular law enforcement. "She's not going anywhere with you," Duncan said. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make. Mr. McCready, we have legal authority to take Mrs. McKinnon into custody for questioning. Show me your warrant." "We don't need a warrant for questioning a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. You do to remove someone from private property against their will." Morrison studied Duncan with new interest, apparently realizing he wasn't dealing with an ignorant mountain man. "You seem to know something about the law." "I know enough. Then you know that interfering with a federal investigation is a serious crime, one that carries significant penalties." Duncan felt the weight of the moment, the choice that would define the rest of his life. He could step aside, let them take Lenora, try to convince himself that legal authorities would treat her fairly, or he could stand his ground and accept the consequences of defying the most powerful detective agency in the country. He thought of Lenora's trust, of the boys calling him Papa, of the family he'd found in the winter wilderness. "Then I guess I'm a criminal," Duncan said, raising his rifle to cover Morrison directly. The temperature in the cabin dropped 10 degrees. The 2 flanking agents shifted position, hands moving toward their weapons. Peters pressed himself back against the wall, clearly wanting no part of what was about to happen, Morrison's face showed no surprise, as if he'd expected this development. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Macready. We really didn't want things to get complicated." "Then leave," Duncan said. "Ride back down the mountain and don't come back." "Can't do that. Too much money involved. Too many important people want answers." Morrison nodded slightly to his men. "Last chance to do this the easy way." Duncan thought of Marie and Anna, buried in ground that was frozen solid 8 months of the year. He thought of 8 years of solitude, of empty conversations with carved wooden birds, of the silence that had nearly driven him mad. Then he thought of Christmas morning laughter and Lenora's gentle singing, and the possibility of being more than just a survivor alone on a mountain. "No," he said simply. Morrison sighed. "Take him." The first shot came from Hayes, the agent to Morrison's left. Duncan was already moving, his cavalry reflexes taking over as he dove behind his heavy oak table. The rifle bullet splintered wood where his chest had been a heartbeat before. Duncan rolled, came up with his rifle, and put a bullet through Hayes's shoulder, spinning the man around and sending his pistol flying. When down, 2 to go, Garrett was faster, more experienced. His shot took Duncan high in the left arm, the bullet burning through muscle and numbing his entire limb. Duncan switched his rifle to one-handed operation, using the table as cover while he tried to locate his remaining opponents. Morrison had taken cover behind Duncan's stone fireplace, using the solid chimney as a shield while he called out orders to his remaining man. "Garrett, circle around. I'll keep him pinned." But Garrett never got the chance to execute the maneuver. The root cellar door exploded upward, and Lenora emerged like an avenging angel, her sewing scissors clutched in her right hand. She moved with desperate speed, crossing the cabin in 3 quick strides before Garrett could turn to face the new threat. The sharp points of the scissors found the space between Garrett's ribs with surgical precision. He gasped, tried to bring his gun around, but Lenora twisted the makeshift weapon and he collapsed, gasping for breath. Morrison, seeing his team eliminated, made a desperate play. He grabbed Peters and hauled the bounty hunter in front of him as a human shield, pressing his pistol to the man's temple. "Enough," Morrison shouted. "Lower your weapons or Peters dies." Duncan kept his rifle trained on Morrison despite the throbbing pain in his wounded arm. "Peters isn't my friend. Shoot him if you want." Peters went rigid with terror. "Wait, let's talk about this. There has to be a way." "Shut up," Morrison snapped. He was bleeding from a graze on his cheek, and his cultured demeanor had cracked to reveal something harder underneath. "Macready, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. All we want is the woman. Give her to us, and you can go back to your hermit life." Not happening. Lenora had retrieved Garrett's fallen pistol and now stood beside Duncan, her face streaked with blood and dirt, but her eyes blazing with fierce determination. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Morrison's face twisted with frustration. "Do you people have any idea what you're dealing with? The Pinkerton Agency has resources you can't imagine. We will hunt you to the ends of the earth if necessary. Then you'll have to catch us first," Duncan said. It was then that Morrison made his fatal mistake. Frustrated beyond endurance, he shoved Peters away and brought his gun around toward Lenora. Duncan was already moving, Marie's knife leaving his hand in a smooth, practiced motion, honed by years of solitary practice. The blade took Morrison in the throat, cutting off his threat in a gurgle of blood and surprise. He dropped his pistol and staggered backward, both hands clutching at the wound, before collapsing beside his fireplace. Silence fell over the cabin like snow. Hayes lay unconscious from blood loss. Garrett was curled around his punctured lung, gasping for breath, and Morrison was very still beside the hearth. Peters cowered against the wall, apparently trying to make himself invisible. Duncan sagged against his table, suddenly aware of how much blood he was losing from his arm wound. Lenora was beside him instantly, tearing strips from her petticoat to make a bandage. "How bad?" she asked, her voice steady despite everything she'd just been through. "I'll live." Duncan looked at the carnage around his cabin. "But we can't stay here." "I know." Lenora worked quickly, binding his wound with the efficiency of someone who'd tended injuries before. "They'll send more men when these don't report back." Duncan nodded, already planning their escape. "We'll need supplies, warm clothes, everything we can carry. There's a place deeper in the mountains, an old mining camp. Abandoned, but the buildings are still sound. We can winter there, decide what to do come spring. What about him?" Lenora nodded toward Peters, who was trying to edge toward the door. Duncan considered their options. Peters had brought this disaster down on them, but he was also a potentially valuable source of information about what other threats they might face. "Peters," Duncan called out, "you have a choice. You can take one of those horses outside and ride back to wherever you came from. Tell whoever sent you that Lenora McKinnon is dead, killed in the fight with the Pinkertons." Peters looked up hopefully. "And if I do that, you live. You collect whatever reward you can for bringing back word of our deaths. You find a new line of work that doesn't involve hunting innocent people. What if I don't?" Duncan's expression went cold. "Then you don't leave this mountain alive." Peters scrambled for the door. "I'll do it. I'll tell them you're all dead." "Good choice." As Peters fled into the morning cold, Duncan turned to Lenora. She was checking on her boys, who had finally been allowed to emerge from the root cellar. They looked frightened but unharmed, clutching their wooden horses and staring at the aftermath of violence with wide eyes. "Are we safe now, Mama?" James asked. Lenora looked at Duncan, who was already gathering essential supplies with his good arm. "We will be, sweetheart. We're going on an adventure to a new home. Will Papa Duncan come with us?" David asked. Duncan stopped his packing and looked at the small boy who'd called him Papa without hesitation. Despite everything, the violence, the danger, the uncertain future, he felt something warm and sure settle in his chest. "Try to stop me," he said. Outside, the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the mountain silence. But inside the blood-stained cabin, a family prepared to disappear into the wilderness together, leaving their old lives behind forever. Spring came to the mountains like a benediction, slowly at first, then with gathering warmth that turned snow to streams and filled the air with the green scent of new growth. From the porch of their rebuilt cabin, larger now, with 2 proper bedrooms and a real kitchen, Duncan watched his sons chase each other through meadows bright with wildflowers. His sons. The thought still surprised him with its warmth. 3 months had passed since they'd left the blood-stained cabin behind and disappeared into the high country. The abandoned mining camp had served them well through the worst of the winter. But come March, Duncan had begun building something permanent. Something that spoke of family and future rather than mere survival. Lenora emerged from the cabin, carrying a tray with coffee and the morning mail. Once a month, Duncan made the long trek to Granite Falls for supplies and news. The postmaster there knew him as David McKinnon now, a name Lenora had chosen to honor her late husband while creating a new identity for their family. "Anything interesting?" Duncan asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Letter from my sister in Oregon," Lenora said, settling beside him on the bench he'd built. "She's been worried since my last letter reached her. They'd been careful about contact with the outside world, but Lenora had needed to let her family know she and the boys were alive. The story they'd crafted was simple. Widow and children had found refuge with a mountain man. Marriage had followed naturally. It wasn't far from the truth, really. "Any word about our friends from last winter?" Lenora shook her head. Peters kept his word, it seems. There was a small notice in the Denver paper last month about Pinkerton agents killed in a mountain cabin by unknown assailants. "Case closed due to lack of evidence," Duncan nodded, unsurprised. Peters had chosen survival over revenge, which was probably the smartest decision the bounty hunter had ever made. "Speaking of last winter," Lenora said, reaching into her apron pocket. She withdrew a simple wooden ring, carefully carved from mountain pine and polished to a warm golden sheen. "I believe you promised me something." Duncan took the ring, feeling the smooth wood against his calloused fingers. He'd been working on it during the long evenings, carving it by firelight while the boys slept and Lenora mended clothes or read aloud from her grandmother's Bible. "Lenora McKinnon," he said formally, dropping to one knee beside the bench. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Properly this time, with witnesses and vows and everything that makes it real. She looked down at him, this man who'd saved her life and claimed her heart, who'd fought for her family and built them a home with his own hands. Duncan Macready, I thought you'd never ask. The ceremony took place the following Saturday, performed by a traveling minister who asked no inconvenient questions about their past. The boys served as witnesses, solemn in their responsibility, but bright with excitement. A few neighbors from the distant valley came to celebrate, people who knew them as the McKinnon family and had accepted them without question. As they exchanged vows in the small church in Granite Falls, Duncan reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, he'd been a hermit, alone with his grief and his silence. Now he stood before God and community, promising to love and protect a woman who'd given him back his life. "You may kiss your bride," the minister announced, and Duncan did. While their sons cheered and the small congregation applauded, the reception was held at their cabin, with neighbors bringing food and music and stories. Duncan found himself surrounded by laughter and conversation, by the warm chaos of community life. It was everything he'd fled from years ago, and everything he now realized he'd been missing. As evening settled over the mountains, painting the peaks purple and gold, Duncan and Lenora stood on their porch, watching their guests depart down the winding trail. The boys were finally asleep, exhausted by excitement and cake, curled together in their new bedroom. "Any regrets?" Duncan asked, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. Lenora leaned against him, solid and warm and real. "About what?" "Marrying you? Running away to the wilderness? Fighting Pinkertons with sewing scissors? Any of it." All of it, she was quiet for a moment, considering. "I regret that Thomas had to die for us to find each other. I regret that the boys lost their first father. But regret the rest? Never," Duncan understood. Life was built on a foundation of choices and consequences, of loss balanced against gain. They'd both paid prices to reach this moment, but the cost had been worth it. "What do you think happens now?" Lenora asked. "Now we live," Duncan said simply. "We raise our boys, we build our life, we take each day as it comes. Same as any family, even families that start with desperate bargains in snowstorms." Duncan smiled, remembering that first night, Lenora's fierce plea, the children's trust, his own reluctant decision to help strangers who'd become everything that mattered, especially those families. He said, above them, the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, bright against the mountain darkness. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. A sound of wildness and home and continuity that had echoed in these mountains for centuries. Duncan Macready held his wife close and listened to the night sounds of their valley. Water running over stones, wind in the pines, the soft breathing of sleeping children through the open window. It was the sound of peace, earned through struggle and sealed with love. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices to make and consequences to face. But tonight, on the porch of the home he'd built with his own hands, surrounded by the family he'd never expected to find, Duncan was content to simply be still and grateful for the gift of second chances. After all, sometimes the most desperate bargains lead to the most precious gifts.